The sirens were the first thing that made my chest tighten, a sound that never failed to bring back memories of war zones and emergencies where seconds meant life or death. But this wasn't some battlefield overseas. It was my own front yard in suburban America, and the emergency lights weren't rushing in to save anyone. They were here because a woman named Karen had picked up her phone and dialed 911 on my wife. And her reason, if you could even call it that, was a claim so absurd and venomous it twisted my stomach. She isn't cleaning her floors fast enough. Picture this, a humid July evening. The air thick with the smell of cut grass and charcoal drifting from someone's barbecue down the street. My wife, Alana, had been inside our home, bent over the floorboards with a bucket of lemon-scented cleaner and a mop. She worked hard all week as a nurse, and tonight she was trying to get ahead on chores before her next 12-hour shift. Through our open window came the faint but unmistakable sound of Karen's voice, shrill and laced with that poisonous entitlement that made neighbors shrink away. She wasn't even on our porch this time. She was shouting into her phone in her yard across the street, where anyone walking by could hear. And then came the words, "Yes, officer, I need you to come quickly. My neighbor's wife is refusing to clean properly, and it's creating a safety hazard." The world tilted for a moment, as if the ground had decided to betray gravity. Alana froze mid-swipe, her dark eyes lifting to meet mine in stunned disbelief. The implication wasn't lost on either of us. This wasn't about floors. This was about skin color, about power, about the fragile ego of a woman who saw a black woman in a nice home and felt the need to drag her down by any means necessary. When the police car rolled up, its headlights slicing through our living room curtains, Alana's hands trembled. She whispered, "Not again, Marcus. I can't go through this again." My wife had lived through more 911 weaponizations than anyone ever should, each one a scar invisible to the world but carved deep into her spirit. My pulse roared like a drum as I walked out the front door to meet the officers before they even had a chance to step out. The first officer adjusted his belt, hand hovering near his holster in that subtle but unmistakable way that said he'd been primed for danger. I lifted my palms, voice steady but boiling with barely contained fury. "Evening, officers. Would you like to explain why you're on my property tonight?" Karen appeared right on cue, waddling across the street with an air of smug righteousness, clutching her phone like it was a gavel of divine authority. "That's her," she screeched, pointing at Alana still visible inside, mop in hand. "She refuses to clean her house fast enough. I've seen her slacking all week. It's a hazard, I tell you. Look at the grime. Probably mold. Someone could get sick." One of the younger officers blinked in disbelief, his head turning toward me as though silently asking if this was real life. The older one cleared his throat, muttering, "Ma'am, are you saying you called 911 over household cleaning habits?" Karen's chin jutted out defiantly, the porch light glinting off her sweaty forehead. "Yes, and it's a code violation too. I'll have the HOA back me up. This whole block will suffer if we let her laziness fester. I'm filing charges." That was the moment the dam in me broke. Not into violence, but into truth. "Officers," I said, my voice carrying across the manicured lawns, "what you just witnessed was the abuse of emergency services, a false report meant to intimidate and humiliate my wife. And it's not the first time. This woman has made it her mission to weaponize her phone against every black family that dares live here." Gasps rippled from the shadows where other neighbors had gathered, their porch lights blinking on like a row of watchful eyes. Mrs. Delgado next door crossed her arms and called out, "I've heard her before too. She called the cops on my grandson for selling lemonade last summer. Said it was unsanitary." Another voice chimed in, Mr. Patel shaking his head. "And on my wife for hanging laundry in the yard. She thinks she runs the street, but all she does is terrorize people." Karen's smug mask cracked, the sweat on her brow suddenly looking like desperation instead of dominance. She spat back at them, "You're all just jealous. I'm the only one who cares about keeping this place decent. The HOA will take my side." But here was the twist she never expected. I reached into my folder and pulled out a stack of papers I had kept ready for months, because I knew this day was coming. I raised my voice so every neighbor, every officer, and even the cicadas buzzing in the trees could hear. "This HOA Karen claims to represent?" I said, holding the documents high. "It doesn't exist anymore. The board was dissolved 6 months ago after a county audit uncovered fraud. And who do you think was at the center of it? Her." A collective murmur surged through the crowd like a tide breaking. The officers' faces shifted from caution to sharp suspicion, eyes darting back to Karen, who suddenly looked less like an enforcer of rules and more like a cornered animal. Alana stepped outside then, shoulders squared, her nurse's badge still pinned to her scrubs. Her voice, calm yet ringing with steel, cut through the thick summer night. "Karen, you've been calling the police on me for years, but tonight you crossed a line so absurd it finally exposed you. You thought my worth was tied to how fast I scrub a floor? No, my worth is in the lives I save every shift, in the community I stand with, and in the love I give freely. You'll never take that away." The younger officer nodded at Alana, then turned toward Karen with visible disgust. "Ma'am, you understand that calling 911 under false pretenses is a crime? You've wasted emergency resources. We'll need you to come with us for questioning." Karen screeched, flailing her arms like a trapped bird. "No, this is harassment. I'm the victim here. She's the one lowering our property values with her filthy lifestyle." But the words rang hollow against the wall of truth pressing in on her from every direction. Neighbors began recording on their phones, flashlights illuminating Karen's red face, her sweat-soaked blouse, her trembling jowls. It wasn't just about Alana anymore. It was about every victim of her pettiness, every person she had tried to crush under the weight of her false authority. Tonight, she wasn't the judge. She was the defendant, and the court was the people watching her unravel. And as the officers took her by the arm, not in cuffs yet but with enough firmness to silence her protests, I realized something deeper had shifted. For years, we endured her in silence, thinking each false 911 call was just another storm to weather. But this time, the community had seen, the evidence was undeniable, and the tide had turned. What none of us expected was what happened next. A car pulled up to the curb, its headlights briefly blinding us before shutting off. Out stepped a woman none of us had met before, dressed in a blazer, carrying a leather portfolio. She introduced herself calmly. "I'm Detective Reese from the county attorney's office. I've been monitoring complaints from this neighborhood, and tonight's call gave us the probable cause we needed." She flipped open her folder, revealing pages of reports, timestamps, and audio logs. "Karen Trask has filed over 60 false reports in the past 2 years. We are officially opening a case for harassment, discrimination, and obstruction of emergency services." The silence that followed was heavy with relief, disbelief, and righteous satisfaction. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish stranded on dry land. But no excuses came out this time. She was no longer in control of the story, and that, I realized, was the beginning of her downfall. The crowd that night felt like the jury Karen never thought she would face. Porch lights burned brighter, camera phones stayed trained on her every twitch, and the air itself seemed to shift into something electric, heavy with the collective weight of long-buried frustration. Karen had always lived off intimidation, off the unspoken rule that neighbors would whisper complaints behind closed doors but never dare stand up to her. Tonight, that shield was shattered. Tonight, every eye bore down on her, and she had nowhere to hide. Detective Reese's voice cut through the tension with steady, measured authority. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something. Abuse of emergency services is not just an inconvenience, it puts lives at risk. While officers were driving here on your false report, someone else in this county could have needed immediate assistance. A car accident, a heart attack, a child choking. That's what you stole tonight." The words hit like a gavel strike. Neighbors nodded, murmured, arms crossed in agreement. Karen sputtered, her plump cheeks quivering as she barked. "I was just protecting the neighborhood. I'm the only one who actually cares about keeping this block safe." Detective Reese didn't flinch. She opened her portfolio, pulling out a page filled with highlighted text. "And yet, According to these records, your protection has meant harassing minority families nearly every time. Calls about loud music that didn't exist. Complaints about imaginary trash piles. Reports of strangers that turned out to be the kids who live here. Do you know what that pattern is called, ma'am? It's called racial profiling. A hush fell so deep you could hear the cicadas pause. Alana stepped closer to me, her hand brushing mine, grounding me in that moment. She whispered, "It's finally coming out. Everything she's done. It's finally out in the open." Karen's eyes darted wildly, searching the crowd for sympathy, for a single nod of support. None came. Even the neighbors who used to gossip with her, the ones she thought were her allies, looked away or pulled their children closer. Her empire of intimidation had crumbled, and all that remained was her shrill voice echoing into the night. The officers exchanged glances, and the older one finally said, "Detective, do you want us to bring her down to the station tonight?" Reese's tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. "Yes, she'll be booked for filing a false report. And given the pattern, we'll be moving forward with harassment charges." Karen shrieked as the younger officer produced cuffs, her voice cracking as she tried one last desperate play. "You can't do this to me. I know people on the council, the mayor. You'll all regret this." But the officer clicked the cuffs around her wrists with a sharp metallic snap that cut through the humid night like thunder. The neighbors erupted not in cheers, but in something heavier, deeper, like a collective sigh of relief that had been held in for years. Mrs. Delgado clasped her hands together and muttered a prayer of thanks. Mr. Patel pulled out his phone and recorded every second, ensuring there would be no way for Karen to twist this narrative later. As they guided her toward the patrol car, Karen twisted her neck to glare at Alana. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but I'll sue you. I'll sue you all." Her words were drowned out by the slam of the cruiser door and the ignition turning over. The car pulled away, red and blue lights fading down the street, and with it went the reign of the neighborhood tyrant. But this story wasn't finished yet. The shock of that night was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, our neighborhood was buzzing not with fear of Karen's next outburst, but with court summons and subpoenas. Detective Reese had followed through on her word, building a case that stretched beyond our street and into the county records. Karen had filed over 60 false reports. 60. Each one a scar on someone's dignity, each one a theft of police resources. And now the county was charging her not only with harassment, but with misuse of emergency services and civil rights violations. The trial became a spectacle. News vans parked outside the courthouse, reporters jostling for interviews. Suburban HOA bully faces charges for weaponizing 911. One headline read, "Neighbors unite against serial caller." Another blared. For the first time, the spotlight that Karen craved turned against her, exposing every ugly detail of her entitlement. Alana was called to testify. I watched her walk to the stand, her posture straight, her nurse's badge gleaming like a medal of honor. She recounted the night of the floor cleaning call, her voice steady even as her eyes glistened with the memory of fear. "It wasn't about floors," she told the jury. "It never was. It was about control. It was about someone who thought she could dictate the worth of others based on how they looked, how they lived, how quickly they scrubbed a tile. I've saved lives in operating rooms, and yet in my own home I was treated like a criminal. That's what Karen did to me. That's what she's done to all of us." The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens as journalists captured every word. When she stepped down, I squeezed her hand and whispered, "You were brilliant." She gave a small smile and said, "I wasn't brilliant. I was just finally free." The defense tried to paint Karen as misunderstood, as an overzealous neighbor with good intentions. But video evidence, recordings, and testimony from nearly every household in our community painted a different picture. A woman who thrived on intimidation, who used the power of 911 not to protect but to punish. The jury didn't deliberate long. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Karen's face as the judge read the sentence was a mask of disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend that the rules she bent for so long no longer bent for her. She was sentenced to community service, fines, and a probation term that barred her from serving on any neighborhood committee ever again. To her, it was humiliation. To us, it was liberation. But the story didn't end with her downfall. It blossomed into something greater. The night after the verdict, neighbors gathered on our lawn. Families who had once avoided eye contact, who had once lived in quiet fear of being the next target, now stood shoulder to shoulder. We shared food, laughter, stories of resilience. Children played freely without parents glancing nervously over their shoulders. It felt like a wound finally beginning to heal. And then came the moment I'll never forget. Alana stood in front of the crowd, holding the very mop Karen had mocked her for using. She raised it high, laughter bubbling in her throat, and said, "This mop doesn't represent weakness. It represents work, care, and dignity. And from now on, no one will ever use it to shame us again." The neighbors erupted in applause, some even wiping away tears. It was poetic, symbolic, and utterly perfect. Weeks later, Detective Reese invited us to a county meeting. Inspired by our case, new legislation was being drafted to penalize false 911 calls motivated by bias. They called it Alana's Law. I watched my wife's name etched into policy, into something that would protect countless others, and I felt a pride so fierce it made my chest ache. Karen faded from our lives after that. Her house eventually sold under the weight of fines and legal bills. Rumor had it she moved to another state, quieter, away from the public eye. But her shadow no longer lingered here. Instead, we built something better, something stronger. A community bonded by the ordeal, determined never to let hatred dictate our lives again. And sometimes, on warm evenings when the cicadas sing, Alana and I sit on our porch with lemonade in hand. She leans into me, whispers, "Do you remember the night she called 911 over floors?" I chuckle, kiss her temple and say, "I do. And I remember the night you turned her weapon into your victory. Because that's the truth of it. Karen's cruelty didn't break use, it built us. It lit a fire in our community, forged solidarity out of fear, and carved justice into a system that desperately needed it. And in the end, her downfall wasn't just her punishment, it was our liberation." So now I ask you, the reader, was Karen's punishment enough for the harm she caused? Or should the law go even further to protect innocent families from weaponized 911 calls? Share your thoughts, because stories like ours matter only if they spark change.